Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a historical jackhammer to one of the most powerful and I think densely packed chapters in the entire Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 17.
It's an explosion, really.
It is. This is the moment a foundational narrative of divine sovereignty, spiritual warfare, and just radical provision bursts onto the scene. We meet the prophet Elijah the Tishbite, a figure who appears out of absolutely nowhere.
Right, straight into the fire.
And he's there to confront what was, you could argue, the absolute height of Israel's spiritual corruption.
It's not just a chapter in a book. It's a foundational theological drama. You've got King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and they are instituting state-sponsored Baal worship. I mean, they're effectively signing Israel's covenant death warrant.
And then, just like you said, out of nowhere, this prophet arrives, and he launches this cosmic contest that begins, ironically, not with fire from the sky, but with a simple weather forecast.
A devastatingly simple forecast.
That's right. And our goal today is to go way beyond the Sunday school version of this story. We're going to really break down, verse by verse, those three sequential miracles.
The drought, the ravens, and the widow.
The drought proclamation, the provision by ravens, and the sustaining of a Gentile widow and her son. We need to unpack the fierce political, theological, and frankly, these psychological dimensions that are just embedded in this text.
Then the New Testament connection.
Yes, crucially, we have to understand why Jesus himself chose this specific ancient drama as a powerful critique hundreds of years later.
And for you, the listener, the stakes here are all about context. This isn't just some regional feud. This deep dive is about understanding the ultimate power struggle between Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God of Israel, and Baal,
the Phoenician storm and fertility god.
The primary Phoenician storm and fertility god whose cult was just dominating the northern kingdom. So the drought is not an accident. It is Yahweh's targeted public declaration of supremacy over everything Baal supposedly controlled, the rain, fertility, and at the end of the day, life itself.
Okay, so before Elijah can even confront the spiritual sickness, we have to diagnose the patient. And that patient is led by King Ahab. Let's set that stage, because the corruption wasn't just, happening on the side. It was institutionalized at the highest levels.
It was policy.
Who was Ahab, and why was his reign such a catastrophic turning point for the northern kingdom?
Well, Ahab was a giant of a king, politically speaking. He was the son of Omri, who founded the very powerful Omride dynasty. Omri's the one who established Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel.
Right.
So we're talking about a reign that lasted for about 22 years, somewhere around 874 to 853 BCE. This dynasty was wealthy, they were militarily strong, politically savvy, they secured international treaties, built significant infrastructure. I mean, in the world's eyes, they were a massive success story.
So he was a king who delivered on the political and economic stability front.
He was.
But at what spiritual cost?
Yeah.
Because the biblical assessment of him is it's brutal. It calls him worse than all who came before him.
And that's the critical distinction. Ahab's international political success was, directly secured through spiritual compromise. The text is clear. It says he did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all who were before him.
And his biggest mistake was that marriage.
His pivotal error was his foreign strategic alliance, which was cemented by his marriage to Jezebel, the Phoenician princess from Sidon.
And this wasn't just, marrying a foreign woman. This was importing a foreign religion and essentially making it the state religion.
Exactly. That's the key. Jezebel brought with her state-sponsored Baal and Asherah worship. And Ahab didn't just tolerate it, he actively built a house and an altar for Baal right in Samaria, the nation's capital.
Oh.
This elevated the national sin from just popular deviation, people worshiping idols in secret, to institutionalized apostasy, which was enforced and celebrated by the crown. The wealth and the military power of the Omride dynasty were directly linked to their defiance of the God of the covenant.
And this political context is absolutely vital because it frames Elijah's sudden dramatic appearance in verse 1. He just steps right out of the shadows, Elijah the Tishbite. What do we even know about his background? Because it seems so obscure, and why is that so important?
Well, Elijah is deliberately presented as an outsider. He's identified as the Tishbite from the settlers of Gilead, which is this rugged, wild Transjordanian region east of the Jordan River.
So not the capital.
Not even close to the cultured, sophisticated center of Samaria. His obscure background is there to emphasize that he operates completely outside the court structure, outside the political establishment. His appearance is sudden, it's immediate, and it highlights that his authority is entirely divine, not, bureaucratic.
And when he walks into that sophisticated Baal-worshipping court, his very name is the first act of defiance.
It's an immediate spiritual confrontation. His Hebrew name, Eliyahu, literally means Yahweh is my God.
I mean, you can just picture it.
Imagine him standing before King Ahab, whose entire political power is linked directly to the patronage of Baal, and he introduces himself by saying, in essence, I am the man whose very identity confirms your deity is false. It's an incredibly audacious confrontation before a single word of the prophecy is even spoken.
And that oracle, the actual declaration, it's delivered with this incredible solemnity. It uses a very specific covenant formula.
It's the formal declaration of a prophetic lawsuit against the king. Elijah confronts Ahab directly, and he uses this solemn oath, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, and then he declares, there will be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word.
Okay, let's pull that oath apart. As the Lord God of Israel lives, that's a direct challenge to the reality of Baal, isn't it?
It challenges the very existence of Baal as a living god. In the ancient Near East, the phrase, as my God lives, functions as a legally binding oath. So Elijah is swearing by God that Ahab has rejected, and he's asserting that this living God, Yahweh, is the one who actually controls life.
And the second part, before whom I stand.
That phrase identifies Elijah as a covenant sentinel. It means he's one who stands continually in God's counsel and speaks with his delegated authority. It makes him the true king's messenger, not just some political dissident.
And the consequence of this oath, the drought, is absolutely devastating because it's a direct hit on Baal's entire resume.
That's the genius of the judgment. Baal was known primarily as the storm god. He's the one who was supposed to control the seasonal rains that are necessary for agriculture and for life. He's often depicted holding a thunderbolt.
So if Baal is in charge of the heavens and the rain and fertility.
Exactly. Then the immediate cessation of all dew and all rain at the command of Yahweh's prophet proves, conclusively, that Baal is powerless. This is Yahweh asserting his total supremacy over the skies.
And what about politically? How does this drought affect Ahab's authority? Because a king's job was often seen as guaranteeing the land's fertility.
Well, in the ancient Near East, the king often functioned as a mediator between the gods and the people. If the king was righteous, the gods would grant prosperity, rain, fertility.
So when a drought hits,
it's the ultimate public indictment. It tells the people that the king's foreign, idolatrous policies have resulted in cosmic rejection. A king who can't command rain can't protect his people. This leads to widespread economic collapse, starvation, and a complete destabilization of the entire Amorite regime. I mean, the drought just strips Ahab of his legitimacy.
And spiritually, this is the activation of the covenant sanctions. This isn't just a random disaster.
Oh, not at all. This directly fulfills the curses that are outlined in the Torah, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 11, where God warned Israel that if they turned away to worship other gods, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce.
So the drought is the physical proof.
It's the tangible, inescapable manifestation of God's adherence to his own covenant word.
And the fact that we later learn from James in the New Testament that this drought lasted for 3.5 years, that just underscores its severity and its purpose. It was to force Israel to confront the reality that their chosen God, Baal, couldn't even save them from the weather, let alone from death.
It forces a national existential choice. The spiritual battle starts with the sky locking down, and Elijah, having delivered this devastating news, is immediately told by Yahweh, "You're no longer useful here. It's time for a retreat."
That transition is so fascinating. Elijah, having performed this incredibly audacious public act of confrontation, is immediately commanded to just withdraw. It seems totally counterintuitive for a prophet who's challenging an empire.
But it's necessary. It's spiritual strategy and it's obedience.
Yeah.
The command in verses 2 and 3 is explicit. Go to the east and hide yourself by the Brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. This withdrawal separates Elijah from Ahab's immediate and no doubt murderous pursuit.
Sure.
But more importantly, it separates Elijah from dependence on human resources or, the public spotlight.
So this is less about physical safety and more about his own character development.
Exactly. It's Elijah's divine training program. Cherith, or Wadi Cherith, is a seasonal stream, a deep ravine, likely in that rugged region east of the Jordan. The name itself is sometimes linked to a Hebrew root meaning to cut away or to separate.
So it's a place of separation.
It's his period of isolation and refinement where he has to learn absolute, immediate obedience and dependence. He drinks from the natural means, the brook, but the food provision is what completely, utterly defies logic.
The ravens, this unconventional provision, verses 4 through 6, is just a masterclass in God's sovereignty over our expectations.
God commands ravens, the Orvim, to bring him bread and meat morning and evening. And you have like 3 powerful lessons packed in here. The dual means of provision, the lesson of daily sufficiency, and this radical theological subversion.
Okay, let's dive into that subversion. Why is the choice of the ravens so theologically provocative?
Well, ravens are explicitly categorized as ritually unclean birds in Leviticus 11. They're scavengers, they're associated with impurity and desolation, the exact opposite of what you'd want touching the food of a holy prophet.
Right.
Yet God commands these ceremonially unacceptable creatures to bring Elijah sustenance that is ritually clean bread and meat.
So it's as if God is teaching Elijah that his power operates outside and, frankly, above human ritual categories.
Precisely. If Elijah was concerned with maintaining ritual purity according to Levitical law, he would be horrified to eat food delivered by an unclean bird. But God demonstrates that his sovereign authority transcends ritual constraints. He can use the unexpected, the socially marginalized, even the ceremonially unacceptable to achieve holy ends. It's a powerful statement against hyperlegalism.
And the timing, morning and evening, it really does mimic the manna provision in the wilderness, doesn't it?
It forces daily dependence. Elijah can't hoard the food. He has to trust that these unclean birds will show up again tomorrow. This period is rightly called Elijah's Cherith Valley University. The lesson is so profound. Don't trust in God's gifts, the water, the fruit, but in the God himself. He teaches Elijah to depend on the promise of provision, not the storage of provision.
And that lesson is driven home with just brutal clarity in verse 7. The one security measure he has, the brook itself, fails.
The brook dries up, and this is the devastating logical consequence of the drought that Elijah himself proclaimed. The visible, natural means of provision, the water, it just vanishes. This is a critical point. God sustains Elijah until the brook is dry, demonstrating that God's methods are provisional and catalytic. They're not permanent. Your comfort zone is temporary.
So the failure of the brook confirms the seriousness of the judgment he declared, but it also signals that Elijah's training is complete. It's forcing him to move to a new, deeper level of faith.
And a commentator once noted that this moment revealed a profound humility in Elijah. He learned that his own life and strength were like a dried-up brook. He was just a channel for the living water. If he couldn't even rely on a natural stream during a drought, he announced, how could he possibly rely on himself? He had to transition from trusting a visible, albeit shrinking resource, to trusting only the unseen divine command.
And the next command, in verses 8 and 9, is truly shocking. It demonstrates God's radical counterintuitive planning. God doesn't send Elijah back to Israel, a land filled with people who should be caring for a prophet of God.
No.
He sends him deeper into enemy territory.
The command is, arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Now, let's underline the geography here. Zarephath, or Sarepta, is a Phoenician coastal city located between Tyre and Sidon.
And Sidon is?
Sidon is Jezebel's hometown.
Right.
God is sending his prophet to be sustained in the geographical and spiritual heartland of Baal worship. This is spiritual warfare executed through relocation.
And the provider God chooses is just as unlikely as the place, a Gentile widow.
He is commanded to dwell with and be sustained by a Gentile widow woman, an almana. In ancient society, the widow was the quintessential symbol of vulnerability. They lacked male protection, social status, economic security.
The most vulnerable person?
The most vulnerable. God chooses the most marginalized, most vulnerable social archetype in an enemy nation to sustain his prophet. This is a profound statement about the scope of God's care and, a deliberate critique of unfaithful, wealthy Israel.
So the encounter at the city gate in verses 10 through 12 just highlights the depth of this crisis and the test of scarcity.
Right. Elijah finds her gathering sticks, which is a deeply symbolic act. It signifies she's preparing for one last desperate meal. He asks first for water, which just confirms how severe the drought is, and then he makes the audacious demand for a piece of bread. And the widow's reply, it just captures the psychological toll of the famine.
She basically lays it all out. She has only Handful of meal in a barrel and a little oil in a cruse for one last meal for her son and herself. And after that, they expect to eat it and die.
This is the logic of scarcity taken to its absolute extreme. It's a mindset of total resignation, where the horizon of hope is literally one last bowl of food.
And her oath is interesting, too.
Notice her oath, yeah. She says, "As the Lord thy God lives." She acknowledges Yahweh's existence, but she distances herself. She shows she hasn't yet appropriated him as her God. She is a desperate Gentile outsider, and her ultimate concern is securing her son's final moments.
Yeah, and Elijah immediately confronts that logic with this call to sacrificial obedience in verses 13 and 14. This is the ultimate priority reversal.
It is breathtaking. Elijah says, "Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first." This isn't just a request, it's an extreme theological test. He is asking her to sacrifice her final morsel of life-sustaining provision for a stranger, a prophet of arrival, God based solely on an invisible promise.
Her choice is between tangible reality, the handful of flour,
And the certainty of God's word.
and the promise guarantees this sustained miracle.
It guarantees that the jar of meal and the bottle of oil will not fail or run out until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. And this establishes a foundational principle that sacrificial giving and radical hospitality, even in lean times, are the very conduit of miraculous provision.
And the miracle is continuous.
It is. It requires daily faith. She doesn't get a warehouse full of supplies. She has to return to that jar and that cruse every single day.
This daily dependence, it just reinforces the lesson that Elijah learned at the brook. The means are provisional, but the source is inexhaustible.
And we see the result in verses 15 and 16. The widow obeys instantly, which just demonstrates extraordinary faith, and the provision lasts for many days. The continuous, inexhaustible supply of flour and oil sustains not just the widow and her son, but also Elijah, the representative of Yahweh, in the heart of Baal's territory.
That's a direct act of spiritual warfare.
It is. It's demonstrating Yahweh's power over Baal's domain of fertility and provision.
And it also gives us this profound social insight. This miracle of sustained life occurred in the house of a Gentile, marginalized woman, while King Ahab's court, with all its wealth and temples to Baal, was literally starving. It's a huge statement about where God places his priority.
God cares for the almana, the vulnerable. The lack of faith in Israel meant the prophet was passed over their doors and sent to a Gentile widow. The covenant promises regarding provision are extended to those who demonstrate radical obedience, regardless of their nationality.
So after this sustained miracle, when you think things are finally settled, tragedy strikes in verse 17, and it raises the stakes exponentially. The widow's son falls deathly ill and dies.
It's an unfathomable crisis. It just throws the stability the miracle brought into complete chaos. The boy isn't just sick. The text says there was no breath left in him.
And the loss of her son, especially for a widow in the ancient world.
It's the loss of her entire future, her economic security, her lineage. It means the end of her hope.
And that grief immediately manifests as this kind of psychological warfare, leading to that devastating accusation in verse 18.
She just lashes out at Elijah. "What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son?" And this is the voice of ancient despair. She attributes her calamity directly to Elijah's holy presence.
The logic being, you're a man of God. Your holiness has revealed some hidden sin in my life, and that sin has brought judgment and death to my son.
Exactly. She connects the holy presence of the prophet directly to doom and perceived guilt.
That's a classic psychological trap, isn't it? Believing that profound suffering must be linked to some specific hidden transgression.
It is. And God counters this narrative of guilt and condemnation not with a lecture, but with life.
Elijah's response in verses 19 through 21 is just incredible. It's immediate, profoundly pastoral, and it demonstrates this radical identification with her suffering.
He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't defend God's motives. He simply requests, "Give me your son." He takes the boy up to the private upper room, the Aliyah, where he lodged. The Aliyah was often used as a place for privacy, for prayer, for meditation. He isolates the crisis with God.
And his prayer is so raw and honest and direct.
He cries out and he questions God's action. "O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourned by slaying her son?" He's appealing to God's compassion and justice on behalf of this marginalized woman who has shown incredible faith and hospitality. He holds nothing back. He's arguing the case of the innocent suffering before God.
And then we have this physical, embodied intercession. He stretches himself upon the child 3 times.
This is persistent, embodied prayer. By stretching himself out, mouth to mouth, hands to hands, he is literally identifying with the dead child, trying to transfer his nephesh, the life force, the breath through his fervent appeal to the God of life. This threefold action symbolizes intense, persistent, and exhaustive appeal. It demonstrates that true faith is not passive, it's intensely active and physical.
And the climax in verses 22 through 24 is the ultimate theological resolution of this entire chapter.
It is. The Lord hears Elijah's voice, and the child's nephesh comes back into him. The child revives. And this is the first recorded instance of resurrection in Scripture.
The very first one.
An act that demonstrates Yahweh's absolute and ultimate authority, not just over rain and provision, but over death itself. This power is the antithesis of Baal, who is often depicted as being temporarily killed and revived through the cycles of the year. Yahweh exerts permanent, sovereign power over life.
Elijah carries the living son down and delivers him to the mother, which leads to her definitive, life-changing confession.
And her journey from suspicion and despair, did you come to bring my sin to remembrance, is completed by this witnessed miracle. She declares, "Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is truth." And that is the goal of the entire narrative. Moving a person from acknowledging the prophet's God, thy God, to recognizing the absolute reliability of God's revealed word.
Okay, so the importance of 1 Kings 17 is just magnified because Jesus himself intentionally chose to highlight this narrative in the New Testament, in Luke chapter 4. And he turns it into a moment of radical political and theological confrontation.
Yeah, the setting is critical. Jesus is in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth. He has just read from Isaiah 61, declaring that the messianic prophecies are fulfilled in him. The crowd initially marvels at his gracious words.
But then they pull back.
They retreat into skepticism. Wait a minute, is this not Joseph's son? We know his family. We have ethnic privilege here.
They expected their local prophet to reserve his miracles for them, to confirm their special status. And Jesus immediately rejects that expectation.
He responds by invoking the proverb, no prophet is welcome in his hometown. And then he uses the Elijah story as the ultimate historical precedent for this rejection. This is where the shock value is just maximized.
He points out that during that terrible 3.5-year drought, the one caused by Ahab's sin, there were many widows in Israel, good covenant people who were suffering and were deserving of care.
Yet Jesus states, Elijah was sent to none of them but to a widow in Zarephath in the land of Sidon. And this allusion is profoundly provocative, especially to a highly nationalistic audience in the first century, who believed the Messiah should focus solely on restoring Jewish glory.
So what is the devastating theological thrust of him citing this story?
This is the scandal of sovereign grace. Jesus exposes Israel's deep-seated covenant unfaithfulness, the very reason they were passed over centuries earlier, by highlighting that God's prophet ignored the many widows in Israel to bless a Gentile outsider in the heartland of idolatry. Jesus affirms God's radical freedom to extend mercy and blessing beyond ethnic, national, or even covenant boundaries.
He's essentially telling them that God prefers faithful outsiders over unfaithful insiders.
Exactly. He is comparing the faithless generation of first-century Nazareth to the faithless Israel of Ahab's time. He shatters their assumptions of ethnic privilege. For them, hearing that a Gentile woman received divine favor while their own ancestors starved was a profound insult, and it confirmed their worst fears, that this new prophetic movement was not about Jewish supremacy.
And their reaction confirms just how severe the critique was.
It leads to immediate violence. The nationalist audience, enraged by the suggestion that Gentiles could receive blessing while Israel was rejected, attempted to drive Jesus over a cliff to kill him. And this entire episode, the prophetic critique, the Gentile inclusion, the violent reaction, is a powerful foreshadowing of Christ's mission and the eventual opening of the gospel to the entire world, which is documented throughout the book of Acts.
And it also establishes a clear typological resonance between the two ministries.
Oh, the parallels are intentional. Elijah's provision in the face of scarcity, his authority over death through resurrection, and his focused ministry to the Gentile outsider, all of it prefigures the comprehensive nature of Christ's ministry and the universal scope of the gospel itself. Elijah serves as a type, an earlier, lesser example of the ultimate prophet to come.
Okay, let's widen the lens now and look at the unseen, behind-the-scenes spiritual battles happening throughout 1 Kings 17, and then move into how these ancient truths relate to our lives today, individually and culturally.
The entire narrative is fundamentally an act of spiritual warfare, but it's fought on Yahweh's terms. Yahweh isn't just fighting Ahab, he is dismantling the entire cosmology of Baalism. Baal claimed domain over rain, fertility, and seasonal renewal. And Yahweh attacks all three.
So by locking the sky, he destroys Baal's rain authority. By providing the provision through the oil and meal, he destroys Baal's fertility claim.
And by resurrecting the boy, he destroys Baal's claim over life and death. Absolutely. The provision for Elijah and the widow, sustained by these unconventional means, is an act of spiritual warfare against the forces of scarcity, death, and idolatry that Jezebel and Ahab incited. Every single miracle is a punch directed at the false god.
And we can't overlook the psychological warfare. The widow's accusation that the prophet's holiness brought her son's death is so relevant to the psychological toll of guilt and despair today.
It's the ultimate psychological trap. Despair convinces us that God's presence brings calamity, not rescue. And God directly counters this narrative. He confronts the despair rooted in perceived sin, not with condemnation, but with the immediate, tangible gift of life, silencing the voice of accusation with the reality of resurrection.
This moves us right into the modern relevance. If you as a listener are facing personal droughts, be they financial, emotional, professional, how does this story encourage us? How does it relate to individual and family economics?
It encourages radical trust in scarcity by shifting our focus from stored wealth to daily dependence. The story teaches us that when you're facing a personal financial drought, you have to practice trusting God for just enough, rather than relying on the visible, finite resources you can see in your bank account or in your pantry.
The empty flour barrel is the perfect metaphor for any resource we believe is finite.
It is. We are called to live on the promise, not on the inventory.
And the humility factor, which Elijah learned at the drying Brook Cherith, that's crucial for our personal growth.
We have to recognize our own lack. Elijah learned, I am nothing. I am a dried up brook. The widow learned, I have nothing. I have only a handful of meal. God creates and sustains out of nothing, ex nihilo, but only when we recognize our own insufficiency. We have to move from the pride of self-sufficiency to the humility of absolute moment-by-moment reliance. That is profound mind renewal.
And what about the cultural and social application? The widow's acts of hospitality is truly a countercultural behavior in an age that is obsessed with self-preservation.
The widow's choice to give her last meal first is a powerful, radical call to risky hospitality and aggressive generosity. In a culture driven by hoarding and consumerism, this chapter champions sacrificial giving as the spiritual law that unlocks sustained, miraculous provision. It embodies community resilience in a crisis.
Her actions just transcend typical human logic. Why would you give away your only lifeline?
Because she trusted the word that promised a future, defying the immediate, visible reality.
So let's elaborate on the mind and behavioral renewal that believers can draw from this entire narrative.
Well, first, the required mindset shift is paramount. We have to reject the logic of scarcity, the eat it and die mindset, and embrace the certainty of God's promise, which is the barrel of meal shall not waste. And that is a daily conscious act of faith, moving from tangible fear to invisible assurance.
And the behavioral renewal involves two specific imitations of the main characters here.
Yes. We have to emulate Elijah's radical obedience, even when the command is completely counterintuitive, like going to Zarephath, an enemy territory, trusting God over personal safety or comfort. And second, we have to emulate his fervent, embodied, physical, intercessory prayer, identifying with suffering and persistently appealing to God with all our energy, just like he did when stretching over the child 3 times.
That's the difference between passive waiting and active faith.
Exactly.
And the ultimate encouragement, drawing everything back to the resurrection, is the assurance that God specializes in reversing dead-end situations.
The climax of the chapter is the ultimate display of God's faithfulness. The resurrection offers profound encouragement that God is faithful to provide not only through the unexpected and the unclean, but that his power is absolute over death itself. The boys' revival assures us that even when our most vital hopes, our resources, our careers, our relationships seem to have taken their last breath, God specializes in bringing life out of the most desperate, clinically dead situations.
So we see that 1 Kings 17 is so much more than a collection of miracles. It's a revival manual for radical obedience, it's a critique of ethnic exclusivity, and it's a demonstration that God's resources are completely unbound by human expectation or physical limitation.
It's a lesson that God's mercy transcends social, political, and ethnic boundaries. And it often flows strongest where the human need is greatest and the human resource is smallest. The story requires us to recognize our own desperate lack so that God can fill it. daily.
So if God was willing to use ritually unclean ravens and a destitute Gentile widow in the heart of Jezebel's home region to sustain his prophet and prove his power over death, what conventional, logical, or cultural limitations are you imposing on God's power and provision in your life today? That's something to consider as you reflect on this deep dive.